Good afternoon, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break and managed to grab some lunch. Egg and tomato sandwich I had, packet of crisps and a coffee. This morning we kind of linked the first session linked to the inauguration event where we introduced the project, and based on the research that 70% of project initiatives, change initiatives that fall by the wayside are unsuccessful, we've used the Education Endowment Foundation 6 stages, and of which the first 4 we've gone through, which kind of is the intent phase really. It brings us to the starting line, it brings us to the point where we can write an implementation plan. So we've gone through that. What will inform your ideas for action and then the strategies that you develop and the teams that you develop and the leadership, the people that you've identified around ensuring those actions are implemented. Informing that decision making will be the results from your survey, either the one you're using from Sheffield Hallam. It could be information from the Devon, was it the Active Lives survey from Devon? But it will also be from what you know about your pupils in terms of their activity levels, in terms of their behaviours, in terms of their performance in your current PE setting. So if you are engaging in high quality leadership and management in physical education, you will be conducting an audit, either an extensive audit or focused on certain aspects of your physical education programme that you want to scrutinise, that you want to analyse, that you may perhaps want to change, that you want to develop, because there's a sense it's not going as well. In this particular case, in this particular project, the focus becomes promoting children's competence and confidence so they become more physically active. So it's not just a case of offering more physical activity, more of the same. It's about really reviewing our curriculum to engage this 30% of children that on all of the surveys nationally and even locally is indicating, and yes, there's some variance, but it's indicating that there's 1 in 3 of children are not engaging, have low low activity levels as part of their health active lifestyle. So it's those people that we need to address, whether boy, girl, mini cohort in terms of diversity, in terms of special educational needs and so on. It's those people that we need to develop ideas and strategize those ideas so that we re-engage them. So if you have gone through an auditing process around this anyway, then you're kind of ahead of the game. If not, I've just been taking you through the process. What we have been started to look at this morning is the whole notion of intent, implementation and impact around your own curriculum design, your own PE programs, and we are referencing the national curriculum in doing that. So, as alluded to, we are really going to scrutinise this whole intent, implementation and impact. And remember, these are just Ofsted's words so that we have a common language. But previously, I can't remember if I mentioned this on the inauguration, but previously an Austrian mathematician, educationist, teacher, Austrian mathematician devised a way of looking at a way of breaking down curriculum, and curriculum was a phrase used to describe the curriculum that was planned, and Ofsted now use the word intent. They like their neuro NLP, their neuro linguistic programming, this I. But he proposed that the curriculum is that which is that is planned, that which is implemented, so that kind of word hasn't changed, and then he called it that which is enacted. And very often the curriculum that was planned and the curriculum that was enacted, there was a disconnect. And this is way back in 1989. Ofsted's research, as I mentioned this morning, was showing that from their research in reviewing their own inspection framework and their own processes and procedures, that there was a minority, a significant minority of schools where there was still this disconnect between what schools are intending and what their impact is. Essentially, all that's saying is that the intent, implementation and impact all have to be aligned. And in this particular case and in this particular context, if we want children to be physically active, and the impact we want to see, and we can quantify that in terms of an outrageous goal that 100% of children meet the CMO's physical activity guidelines, that if that's the impact that we want to see, then our intent needs to be aligned to achieving that, and the implementation, the way we implement it in the school context, the way we teach and learn, needs to be aligned. In doing all of that, I just want you to be, certainly at this intent stage, understand mastery learning, but we will have to touch a little bit on implementation and impact. But those, we'll go deeper into the implementation and impact when we look at the in the June date. So yes, this is a bit of an overview, but yes, we are going deeper into different aspects of this. Again, the indicative content that I sent through to Mark and he sent out to you is that we're going to look at the quality of physical education, but that starts with vision, values and aims of the school. Yes, I've mentioned constructive alignment. Our model of national curriculum is inclusive, progressive and mastery learning. With everything we need to cover, the content we need to cover, we cannot look at things in isolation, so that the way of framing that model, it has to be integrated, or the word used, especially those of you who teach GCSE, examination PE, a synoptic approach, or in other words, an integrated approach to holistic development. At the end, then we're going to look at the clusters and actions between now, your cluster meeting, and then your preparation for the next date in June. A reminder then that this was the inspection framework that was released in May 2019, which was implemented in September 2019, and I believe when we had the induction day, or twilight afternoon, whenever it was, I think somebody had already had a Ofsted inspection. Be interesting to see what happens with the current lockdown. So the quality of physical education. So yes, we are using research. We are using Ofsted's research about why they are framing and looking at curriculum in this way, and the quality of our subjects. The Ofsted category is actually called quality of education for the purposes of this today. In our subject, I'll put the quality of physical education. But this needs to be in alignment, and we are judged on those three things. Plus, I've put in there, again, this is often an Ofsted slide, and I put in there bullets that focus the content that should be in those headings. Behaviour and attitudes did include personal development previously, but personal development has been separated out into its own category. Okay. Part of what I'm going to show you when we get to it is show you how the personal development is aligned already in terms of its language to the physical education programme of study. in the intent and in our implementation and in our impact, we most definitely must have now reference to children being physically active as part of healthy, active lives. And it's something that needs to be integrated into our planning, our delivery, and also our assessment. So I can't talk just about the intent today. I must talk about those things, albeit briefly, and we'll look into it deeper as we go through. What I'd like to do at this stage is, can you just jot down in the chat or jot down on it? You don't have to, but jot down in the chat so I can see, or sorry, the questions I think you've been using. Jot down in the questions your school values. What are your school values? And for some reason, most schools seem to have about 6 values, and respect is usually one of them. But can you just jot them down? One, to see if you can remember them. You might be going Googling it all now, I don't know. Jot down what your school values are. Try not to look. And I'll take it from there. So what are your school values? Okay. That's brilliant, thank you. So when we are talking, let's just clear that from my screen. In the last 5-10 years, there's this phrase been bandied around in education that it's a values-driven education. We should have a values-driven education, and that led a couple of Ofsted frameworks ago to schools developing, probably about 10 years ago, but developing values, and lots of schools display those values on documentation or in the reception in the entrance hall. I know many P departments I've seen take those values and talk about them in sporting context or activity context, and those values are on changing room rules or in corridors leading down to the PE block. But in our national curriculum programme of study that we're referencing, the 3rd sentence on the purpose of study talks about that opportunities to compete in sport or to participate in activities, they build character and embed values. Now the examples it gives here, so that it means that this isn't statutory, so it's such as fairness and respect. Lots of schools, I was reading from your comments, resilience, which I think is key really in terms of mental anxiety and some of the health problems that mental health problems that are manifesting themselves in schools and so on with young people. commitment, determination, but respect always seems to be there. So the idea is that when we outline our intent, physical education, the subject will sit with the school's intent, and values are things that will link the delivery of all subject matter content. So values, the school values, become the cement really that bind the building blocks of our children's education. And I want to explore that a little bit further later. But if respect is part of our values, then and looking at the submissions that you'd all put around what your school values are, if respect is in there, and for the majority it was, then respect starts with respect for yourself before you then respect others. And part of respecting yourself is respecting your body, this body we live our lives in. And if you are going to respect your body, you want it to be in as healthy and as fit a state as possible. So respect, those values can link to our aims. So already we've created some alignments, a clear line of sight, using the national curriculum as a reference. So if we're talking resilience, then we can look at resilience in competitive sports and resilience in terms of winning and losing. Because you need to learn how to win, and also learn how to be magnanimous in defeat. So we can start talking how subjects and school values and the people that we are, the young people that we are developing, are bound by the values that that we are stating would develop in and within them. It's not something that just is developed and then sits on a policy or sits on a wall. It becomes integrative to our whole learning. So I want to talk about, Simon, I'm going to need you to let me know if a particular document comes up now. Is that document?
Yeah, we can see the document.
Okay. So what I've done, I've gone through the personal development references in the school inspection handbook. The inspection framework, first of all, that section there, and then the school inspection handbook, and referenced and literally cut and pasted any reference to personal development. And that first sentence that I've highlighted in yellow essentially replicates what we were just looking at in the physical education programme of study. So the curriculum supports learners to develop their character, and in PE it gave examples as fairness and respect. So the curriculum engagement, the curriculum delivery is going to promote pupils' values, and it is the values that those students espouse makes up their character. And that's what I said, I was talking about this morning. That's what distinguishes, you know, your students from your school as opposed to other students. And I know I used to teach in the Forest of Dean in a school in Cinderford, really cut off area. And they, when I arrived as head of department, they were renowned, the students were renowned for just poor standards of kit, real poor behaviour when they were in school fixtures, to the point that many schools had cut fixtures with the school. And I know when I arrived there, we just wanted to change people's perception of the school. So understand that it's not just about teaching football or netball or gymnastics and all that kind of thing. It is about developing the whole child. So I'm just going to let you set eyes on some of the things that I've pulled out and highlighted. So in here it talks about the British values, so the rule of law, which obviously we can develop those concepts through rules and legislation in sport, mutual respect, tolerance. Again, developing people's character. And then we get some real specific reference in terms of mental and health promotion. And we can see in our physical education aims how it is contributing to children's personal development, the category that Ofsted are now judging across the school. Extracurricular activities that PE contribute massively to. I mean, there's more, and you can look at this and it will be sent through to you. And I'm sure, I mean, if we were doing this face to face, some of you would be telling me that you've gone through this as a school. The senior leadership have asked you to highlight where, as a subject, what aspects you are that you've integrated into your program, your curriculum design, and so on. Yeah, well, I mean, one of the judgments is about willingness to participate in sporting opportunities. So again, we need to ensure children are receptive and engaged in physical education programs, so that when we offer more activity opportunities, including sport, that they'll take them up. So enough. So already, with the new inspection framework, we've got some real obvious alignment are you seeing the PowerPoint slide again, Simon?
Yes, we're seeing the PowerPoint slide. Can you press from current slide?
What are you seeing at the moment then?
Just the edit section for the presentation.
Any change?
That's the presenter view. Can you swap the screen to the other screen? under sharing, show screen. Perfect.
So,
There you go. We can see the slide now.
all right, thanks, fella. So remembering that the personal development category is separate now in the inspection framework, but it was part of the behaviour welfare, the attitude bit in as a combined judgment. Now it's separated out. So it comes as no surprise that it aligns to the programmes of study, which were developed before the last Ofsted framework, and then this framework has just pulled out personal development, and you can clearly see references and alignment to physical education. So if in planning your current curriculum doesn't include value references, and I'll show how that manifests itself a little bit later, but if it doesn't include references to values and personal development, just by referencing the national curriculum, we can ensure that that gets integrated, and I'll show you in our planning, and I can show you how in a little while. There was a question earlier this morning about saying what books. This is from a piece on constructive alignment by Biggs in 2005, and I can send references through if people want to do any more reading. But research theory then basically said that if the components of our curriculum are aligned, then children's progress in terms of the fulfillment of aims will be, their success at achieving those aims will be greater. So in other words, if we've got two national curriculum aims, one that says children should be physically active for sustained periods of time and that they should lead healthy, active lives, and that's the aim of our curriculum, and we are referencing that, then assessment that measures someone's ability in gymnastics or netball or hockey or rugby isn't aligned to telling us whether or not we've achieved our curriculum outcomes. In other words, in Ofsted's language, there is a disconnect between the curriculum measure in terms of impact and our curriculum intent. So if again, I'm going to repeat myself, but if the intent is around children being physically active as part of a healthy, active lifestyle, then our learning outcomes, our learning and teaching activities, and our assessment should all be aligned to ensuring that is, one, implemented, and two, how well we achieve our intent. So if you've got assessment systems that measure how good children are at sport, and that is all, and you are grading them for individual activities and adding that up and averaging it, or whatever you do, then it is misaligned. There is a disconnect between what our curriculum intent is. So if this is what we intend, then our assessment should also measure that. Performance and that in physical education program outcomes can be measured, yes, but it's got to include information around being physically active and as part of a healthy, active lifestyle. So the language that Biggs used in 2005 when they developed this constructive alignment model was curriculum outcomes, which is the intent bit, our teaching approach, which is the implementation bit, and assessment and evaluation, which is the impact bit. And that needs to be aligned and linked. Now, I just want to touch on, so when I was out in Qatar in 2018, we had, and I was authoring the State of Qatar PE curriculum. We had input, all subjects had input from UNESCO to say, when we're looking at implementation, i.e. the teaching and learning, research says that these are the 7 things that need to be in place, to use the analogy, to bake our cake and make it rise so we can put a cherry on the top. If we don't include these ingredients, if we don't include these elements, then our cake will sink, it will be flat, it won't be engaging, it won't be inspiring. So in the next session, when we talk about implementation and also impact, I want to show video and also expand on these areas a little bit more, just so you know what's coming. So when we look at implementation, and much of this in terms of your practice will be good practice and you'll be doing it anyway, but I'm just going to frame it for you and talk about research informed practice. And there may be bits that you can take on board, and there may be bits that you can adopt and adapt as part of your own teaching profile. This is something obviously I would like to do face to face and do an activity. If we have to do it on webinar, if we're still on lockdown, or even if the schools have come back and we're still social distancing, it will be difficult, so it may have to be on webinar. So I'll try and source out some videos.
Andy,
yeah,
we've got a question here, if I may read it out to you.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Can I just explain? I was talking to Simon before, and for whatever reason, I'm not able to adjust my screen setting. It's really quite dark. So I've asked Simon to jump in and ask the questions, because maybe I need glasses, I don't know. But I'm struggling to read the stuff. So yeah, go ahead, Simon, please.
Yeah, of course. It says, will you show a model example of aligned intent / curriculum outcomes and an assessment policy?
I'm not going to show an assessment policy today, because we're going to go deeper into that in the second day in June. But I am going to show alignment, yes.
Understood.
Right, literally after, not this slide, the next slide. After the next slide, I'm going to show you a handout, which I'll email through. So yes, I will, is that the short answer to that question. Is there anything else, Simon?
Not at this time.
This is just the antonym, really, of curriculum alignment, just sort of saying our curriculum isn't a list of activities, it's not the timetable. Our curriculum shouldn't be driven about what we think might be on the exam and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we're going to go deeper into some of the stuff that we did when we looked at tactics and strategies this morning. We're going to go a little bit deeper into that around our intent. If people remember, I'm a big Everton fan. And one of the things I was arguing that De Gea could see the ball all the way, despite Sigurdsson sat down. And I think I put that there was a clear line of sight. So I'm just changing the language on this slide slightly and just talking about curriculum alignment. And then in response to that last question, this is the handout I want to show. So I did get it lined up. So Simon, is there a Word document on the screen?
Yeah, we can see the Word document.
Okay, so remember that I'm going to send this through to you, but all I've done there is listed the aims of national curriculum and highlighted the ones that we want to re-emphasise the focus on. And the interventions, the planning and stuff that you do is going to be driven by your audits, by what you know about your children already, and also by the results of these surveys. So the specific activities, the specific interventions that will become part of your curriculum design may be endemic for different schools, but when you're working in your clusters where certain schools have got similar issues and are looking for similar solutions to problems, then you can, even within your group of 10, work together in 2s or 3s or 4s, clusters within clusters, if you like. But that we don't know what that is yet. I mean, you guys are going to interrogate your data. Yes, the data might be skewed slightly because we're on lockdown and children might not be as physically active at this point in time if they're doing the survey. However, it is a pre and post, and yes, we'll have to take that into account when we look at the post tests. But hey, it's going to, at least you'll be able to show improvement. At least you'll be able to show impact. Excuse me. So the subject content. So this is these boxes I've just cut and pasted from the programme of study. Remember when we looked this morning, we framed this content in as cognitive, affective and psychomotor domains. So this language was in bullet point form. In columns, and we termed it head, heart, hands. So I'm picking out the bits that are aligned to these aims, and this is about children's behaviours. That if we've achieved these aims, then we should be seeing them doing this. But so the language used in the programme of studies indicates both what we call the content to be delivered, and it also indicates how it might be assessed. So if they're not getting involved in exercise, sports and activities at school, when we're making our assessive judgments, when we're being diagnostic about it, is it because they didn't have the confidence, or is it something else? And that, in terms of our monitoring and evaluation, helps ensure that we achieve our aims, and our actions and our interventions are aligned. I've looked down, I've picked out about children then should be take part in competition sports activities outside school through community links or sports clubs. So that's where in the way we framed and remember this is from the book that I wrote in 2015. So that national curriculum, that's a cut and paste literally from national curriculum. We framed it in this way, and I've just shown where those references are in the way we framed it. So if we're just taking those highlighted bits in yellow, and if I summarize these, if I tell you that each of these bulleted statements or bulleted points indicate both the content and the criteria by which it might be judged, and that we can term these programme outcomes. So these are 11. Is that right? Hang on, 3, 5, 9. Yeah, 11 programme outcomes for Key Stage 3. But you already know that each of these programme outcomes can be expanded. So as a department, you would need to identify what tactics and strategies and therefore which activities you're going to cover, what tactics and strategy form the content to be learned. And that might be different for different schools, depending on what you as a team have decided. And even if you are doing the same activities, rugby, hockey, netball, that you still might have different tactics and strategies from other schools, because it's not telling you that you're going to do every single one of them, but that children are going to use a range of tactics and strategies. And that word range, suggests there's going to be multiple, but you're not tied into how many. So these program outcomes can be expanded, and as we already said, once you've identified your tactics and strategies, you're then going to decide in year 7, year 8 and year 9 what ones you want to implement, what order you're going to sequence them, and in many cases that order isn't hugely important. You can decide what order you want them to be in, and again that can be different from to other neighbouring schools, because the sequence of learning is done by key stage. So each key stage scaffolds on a previous key stage, and we know from research into childhood growth and development that children should be able to achieve these program outcomes. When you expand these program outcomes as a staff team, as a department team, you can then sequence them and scaffold them within the key stage as you see fit. But when Ofsted, and it's not for Ofsted obviously, but when Ofsted ask you why is it in this order, you will have a rationale, because you've gone through that thought process. You'll have a rationale as to why you're doing certain strategies in key stage 3. And it might be that you're looking at press, as we mentioned before, in year 9. Why? Because in year 7 you felt they didn't have the children didn't have the fitness to be able to employ a pressing strategy, and you wanted to develop other strategies and other tactics till you got to a point where children can really play games and press the opposition in winning the ball back. But you've got a rationale for why it's in that order. And other schools may start a press, for example, in year 7, but they've got a reason and a rationale for that. So what I've done then is taken these program outcomes and just expanded it slightly to indicate more content. That's all I've done there. So you can see where it's come from. We want children to apply the long-term health benefits of physical activity. So if we want to know what the health benefits are, my thinking then when I'm writing a more detailed outcome is that if we want to know what the health benefits are, we need to know what the components of a healthy lifestyle is first of all, before we can then look at the health benefits. And if they know what the components are and then know the health benefits, then children can make informed decisions. Now, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later in this session, but when you are constructing content within a year or even within a unit within the year as part of your scheme of work for PE, when you're constructing content and experiences, then the outcomes will be co-constructed. So in other words, at the moment, this outcome relates to children's behaviours, what I term the heart column, the affective domain. But when you are constructing activity experiences, you will construct it with outcomes from other columns. So we get this holistic approach around children's doing, around their thinking, and around their behaviours. But for the moment, for the constructive alignment example, we are just taking the alignment from this column. So how does that help us in terms of, okay, so yes, we're going to have to co-construct, but when we look at the components, I've just put a diagram here, and it depends on what books you read. There's 5 or 6 components of a healthy lifestyle. The most recent one is the environmental one that people have added. And what I've started to do then is, once we've looked at the components from physical, emotional, social, mental, spiritual, and environmental, I've then started giving some headline success criteria. So if students understand and apply the physical component of healthy active lifestyle, the 6 health components, then I would expect to see them exercising regularly. I would free of illness. That would mean that they attend school more, they eat a balanced diet, and schools who have moneyless schemes, contactless cards and stuff, you can monitor what children are eating. I know some schools do it, for example. I just realised tobacco is spelled incorrectly there, tobacco. But yeah, you get to know those children that are down the local park drinking alcohol with their mates at weekends and sometimes during the week and so on, and other children tell you. And we're constantly looking to address those kind of issues. So all I've done then is gone through each of the components and created some success criteria. And again, you can change that specifically, but according to the needs of your children. But that essentially rounds off a constructive alignment example, and it allows you, in most of those instances, to assess whether or not your implementation has been successful. So even if at this planning and intent stage, we are planning with the end in mind. And then you can then sequence in year 7, year 8 and year 9 and scaffold it across up from year 7, 8 and 9, that content there. You can decide how that might be sequenced and scaffolded. So I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint. So Simon, you're going to have to let me know.
Yep, perfect. We can see the presentation.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any more questions, fella?
Not at this time.
Okay. So I want to do a little bit more before I come back. I'll come back to these slides. I'm going to do some more work on them, but before I do, yeah. I'm going to look at pull my questions box open. Simon, can you have a look as well? But I'm just going to ask you a question, and I want people to type in the answer as quick as you can into the question box. I just want to see how long it takes people. So literally, it's going to be a short answer, and as soon as you got the answer, drop it in, please. So the question then, for which I want the answer as quick as possible, is what is 19 times 6?
$114. Scott, Daniel, Jamie, yeah.
Quality. Okay. One of the things I was looking briefly at my watch, because a maths colleague of mine informs me that if you have mastered the stages that you need to work that question out abstractly in your head, that you will respond if we were face to face. If you'd mastered the stages around doing that without writing on paper or on a calculator, and you could do that in your head, you would respond within 3 seconds. So even with having to type it in, the first few were within 3 seconds. I was allowing about 5 seconds for the response. And you may have used different methods. You might have done partitioning and looked at 6 times 10 and then 6 times 9 and added it together, or you might have estimated around in terms of 6 times 20, because it's easy with a naught, and then you take a 6 off. So you might have used different methods, but the important thing in terms of you being able to arrive at that answer within 3 seconds is that there will be stages that you've mastered in your maths experiences in school. So that starts right with numbers and integers. It'll start in a concrete form with apples and oranges in primary school, or blocks and whatever they use now. And children will be looking at 1, add 1, and they will physically have to move an orange over and then add another orange to it and then count it, and then they can come up with the answer 2, and then they start recognizing number patterns. Then you've got to do units. Is it ones they call it now? Ones and tens. They have to understand partitioning. So there's a number of things that need to happen before you can master it. But there'll be some of you out there that as soon as I said that, gave you that sum, would have gone, and if we could have seen you, I'd have seen your reaction, wouldn't have even bothered trying to do it, because they'd have been put off by it, because they don't feel competent. There'll be some people picking a pen up and wanting to write it on paper because they haven't mastered certain stages, so they couldn't do it in an abstract fashion. And it's the same in a PE context. And I remember this, especially with things like swimming, sometimes with rugby. The response from children when you say, right, next week bring your rugby kit because we're going on to rugby. Next week, can you bring, make sure you bring your swimming kit, we're going on to swimming. And there are children that if they hadn't mastered certain aspects in that activity and they didn't feel competent, you could see their reaction, they were turned off straight away. So we need to engage learners, we need to think about the activities that we are offering them, and we need to teach for mastery. So I'm just going to go a little bit more depth for you into mastery. When the expert panel reviewed the curriculum, and this was, if you remember, our education secretary at the time, Michael Gove, in 2010, ordered a review of our curriculum. And an expert panel was formed, and the chair of the expert panel was Tim Oates from Cambridge University. And he also has a lot to do with OCR assessment linked to the examinations, GCSE, GCAS and A-level. They were commissioned in 2010 and they reported in the December of 2011. And they'd looked at all the high performing jurisdictions around the world, and they came back and said, look, there's three things in common that all the high performance jurisdictions have in terms of what that defines their model of national curriculum, and that is one that focuses on inclusion, mastery and progress. Now, we've talked about inclusion when, you know, in reference to all and all that kind of stuff, but let's just focus on the mastery bit for now. And this is taken from a Department for Education training slide. So in primary schools, all teachers had English and maths mastery training. And when I do work with primary schools, it's quite refreshing to know that because they understand what mastery is, when we talk about mastery in physical education terms, they get it. Now, I don't know if in secondary, I'm not aware if you've had mastery training, but this is essentially a DFE training slide when they did mastery training for maths, the teachers of maths and English. And these are the features of mastery learning. So a few things I want to say and a few pointers for you when you are designing curriculum or redesigning curriculum, because you know you've got plenty of time between now and September to do this and meet the needs of your learners, especially when we interrogate all the survey results and so on. But Ofsted don't refer to any type of a pedagogical approach, and mastery is often associated with a particular approach. So what Ofsted refer to as mastery in their handbook, they use the term deep, and often within the phrase deep structural knowledge. And if we understand deep structural knowledge and how it's formed, then it doesn't happen in 20 minutes in a lesson. And what I refer to there is schools, and again, I don't know your practice, is schools that spend a half-term block. Why? Because national curriculum used to be organised around 6 activity areas, which it's not anymore, as you know. And those 6 activity areas slotted nicely into 6 half-term blocks. But we still have got practice like that where, you know, we've got netball week 1, shoulder pass, netball week 2, marking and dodging, netball week 3, footwork, netball week 4, shooting. Essentially, we've got some children in week 4 that still haven't mastered the shoulder pass yet. So an approach, or a traditional approach, that includes a warm-up or an introductory activity, a link activity, a main theme and a plenary, which in PE often translates to warm-up, skill, and then a skill applied in a game. So if it was passing, well, right, okay, as soon as you get the ball, you've got to make, I don't know, 5 passes before you can score a goal, or 5 passes before you can actually shoot, or whatever that might be, whether it's netball, hockey, football, rugby, and so on. An approach that isolates practice is not a mastery approach, because we've then got, what, 20 minutes to practice the skill and then maybe 10-15 minutes to apply it, and then next week, because we're on to a different skill, we condition the game to focus on that skill. We're not reinforcing learning that's gone before. We're doing something different, even though we're still calling it netball. And yes, I use the example netball, but it could be any game. So part of a mastery approach is one where learning is joined up and learning is happening consistently. So we don't just do it 1 week and we leave it and then we go on to something else the next week. Now, I'm painting a worst case scenario, and I'm sure that none of your practice kind of mirrors that in the teaching and learning into transaction. But when you are thinking curriculum design, perhaps need to think either about blocking or extending units beyond just 6 weeks. Now, Ofsted research back, I think it was around about 2008, said that the most progress they see was when units are between 10 and 12 hours in length. So anything less doesn't really allow for mastery learning. So when you, the other thing I just want to mention on that is that the activities that you choose as the vehicle for this learning in physical education, and there, as you know, there are 11 bullets, 11 program outcomes. The activities you choose also need to be thought through carefully, because there's many schools I've gone into where they've done sort of, I don't know, netball or basketball in the autumn term, the first half term. So in terms of throwing and catching activity, and then there'll be a 7-month gap until they do any kind of throwing and catching again. So it's not just week to week, it's also activity to activity, and how you can ensure learning is not only sequenced, but coherent and continuous. Okay, so let's just look at mastery learning in terms of these bullets. So when I co-construct an experience, and just say, for argument's sake, that in netball again, that I might use a range of tactics and strategy to overcome opponents, and given the conditions and the rules of the game, that we'll press in across 2/3. We might overload on the left-hand side, so the wing attack will take up position down the left-hand side. So we'll look to overload and overlap in that way, creating and exploiting space on the other side of the court and so on. But I would need to look at then the expert technique to ensure that those tactics and strategies can happen. So I'm starting to construct connections and relationships that I need to teach because they are related and they are interdependent on each other. So if I can't pass accurately, or if I can't adapt my technique from a shoulder pass to a bounce pass or a chest pass or overhead pass, and my footwork skills aren't sufficiently expert to allow me to pass fluently and not contravene the rules of the game, then the tactics and strategies we plan are irrelevant, really. So the skills are going to relate to tactics and strategies, but I also, within this context and within the context of this project, want children to participate in exercise, sports and activities out of school. And I'm just reading from the top bullet in the right-hand column, the heart column. So you can co-construct, and you should be able to look at any of those bullets in your understanding and not only then expand them as a department and know what content you are covering, just as I expanded the components of health, the health benefits, and co-construct that with other learning content, and then present it in a way that is joined up, that makes connections to learners. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to a minute to kind of test yourself really, and pick out any 3 bullets and talk about how think through the linkage, the relationship, and then how that might be presented to learners. Okay. Now, your thought processes can go on individually after this, but in the part of the what we're loosely terming SLE role is to kind of chair conversations where you take your thinking forward and share ideas about this, which is more difficult on a webinar with so many of you out there. So discussions can take place in smaller groups around this. So we're starting to build a picture of mastery learning. This morning we said that mastery learning was learning that if you learnt in one context, if you'd mastered it in one context, you'd be able to apply it in another context. And the example we gave this morning was the press. So if we've learned the press in a basketball context, and we were the next games activity we did was half a term later, and we should then be able to apply it in a netball context or a football context, because we understand what pressing is and the tactics that are required individually and groups of individuals to ensure that the pressing strategy works, is successful. And we've now then looked at mastery learning as children are able to establish links between these program outcomes, or when you've broken them down, when you've expanded them and then broken them down, that what will be your unit outcomes. So the way the context, the frame is important, because the content matter aligns to the aims of national curriculum. So the content matter around about participating, exercising, sports and activities out of school certainly aligns to the national curriculum aims, and we should be referencing those. And therefore, this needs to be integrated as part of your everyday PE lessons. You need to be advocates of the importance of participating in activities, sports, and so on. The link for you, obviously, in terms of parallel processes, is that if students are competent and they are enjoying these things, then they are more likely to participate. But for learners, we want this to be joined up so they become competent performers, competent decision makers, and competent in terms of their physical activity behaviours. So the other aspect of mastery learning that I haven't covered is that you do not have to be perfect in each of these, but you do need to have mastered the content that you have decided. And again, I'll use the example of tactics and strategies, the content you've identified around tactics and strategies. And children need to be successful in those more often than not, is the phrase, so a majority of the time. So if you were loosely counting, if you were counting, I'm not suggesting you are for a minute, but if you were counting, I don't know, set shots attempts in basketball, and a student is regularly getting 6 out of 10, they have mastered that particular skill. Again, I'm not saying you count them, but you know from gut instinct if children are mastering it more often than not. Do they look like a basketball player? So if they've got the expert technique, then they will. For me, the best example, and an example I often use, is in netball. If children, if students look like netball players, the thing that distinguishes that for me is the footwork from any other activity. And you could see if someone has mastered that kind of footwork performance, because for me, that's the essential ingredient and makes them look like a netball player. So mastery, you can apply things learned from one context to another context. You can make connections within the activity, but from activity to activity, and you could even make connections to other subjects, and that's important. So when Ofsted look at in terms of deep dives, they also want to, they'll have spoken to the head teacher, the senior leadership team, and they want to know where PE sits in relation to other subjects, how it impacts on them, how it influences learning across the curriculum. So if you're building trust through physical education activities, that is a key skill around personal development that will help learning in other lessons, for example. So you need to know and identify that, and we can then map this to personal development. So building connections is second, and then the third is that children are mastering each individual element. They are performing it a majority of the time. We're not looking at perfection, majority of the time. Now, I haven't looked at any questions, but already I'm sure people are going to start having questions about assessment. And yes, we're going to look at it briefly, but we're going to look at it far more in the next day. Okay, what I want to do is, okay, I'm going to show two things. Before I look at the assessment bit, I just want to look at, where did I put it? Oh, I think I've got it as a handout. So Simon, I'm going to just ask you that this document displays again. I think it might be that one. Let's have a look. Yeah. So have you got a Word document on your?
Yes, we do. Yeah, Key Stage 3, Year 8.
So this is work that I've done with some individual schools on this project, and literally it's a unit of work, and it's 2 sides long. I mean, part of what I wanted to do was, do some practical, obviously, with you all, and illustrate this in practice. But so rather than, this is down to choice, but what we've got here in unit terms is a unit that's focusing on this learning content, refining, analysing, participating. And the example activities I've done that in is, as you can see on there, I've given football and dance as the examples. But let's just take you through this. So what we've got straight away in the title of this unit, and this is a way, not the way. So however you address this whole notion of relationship integration, or one of the things that one of the roles I picked up a few years ago was I was the lead reviewer for Ofqual. I was termed a subject expert, Ofqual subject expert, for the review of the GCSE, GCE, AS, and A-level qualifications. And one of the changes there was this whole notion of deep learning. And if you remember, 2 or 3 years before we went from the legacy GCSEs to the reformed GCSEs, the 6-marker question was started in exams. And what we had in the last 2 or 3 years of our league tables, our grading, was for the first time since the records around GCSE were kept, we had reduced percentages at A star to C because of the 6-marker. And the average, I think the average mark when it first came out was something like 2.3 out of 6. And that was a little test, really, in terms of a system-wide test to see how well students were being prepared in terms of their deep structural knowledge. And the conclusion was that actually we weren't. They were being taught to the test, taught to the exam. And so that, with the national curriculum, also prompted a reform of GCSEs, because internationally we were falling down the league tables in comparison against other countries. So it was felt that the legacy GCSEs had reached their shelf life. So one of the things that was developed then was this, about this deep structural knowledge, but also what was called synoptic learning. And I think it's referred to that in a lot of the specifications. I mean, that was another word change. We went to specification of learning rather than syllabus, so not just content to be ticked off when it was covered, but learning that was specified and learning that needed to be synoptic, i.e. connected to other learning. So you've got a change in the exam papers and the way they're constructed. And those of you do marking, or those of you seen the SAMs, the sample assessment marking schemes, then you will see that there are marks given for how students link with other areas. So this whole notion of synoptic learning came about throughout the system. Mastery learning, we're referring to it now, but or again, Ofsted term, deep structural learning. So straight away, that title suggests that we are going to present this in a way that we combine refining, analysing, participating. The word commitment suggests a value, something that's value driven. So in purple in italics, you can read this at your will because you'll get this PowerPoint, but the italics explains the different boxes, but I've got pupil expectations. And you can see how the language is aligned to national curriculum language. But I've also got teacher expectations. So if a teacher didn't know our example earlier around tactics and strategy, then it's about them to go and research that, or go and look at department documentation if they're new to the department that identifies and outlines what tactics and strategies that we are going to we've developed as the learning content. Or if it's in a particular approach around teaching games for understanding or sport education or a Kentness in dance, then there may be some internal CPD that's required. If you're doing this as part of this review, then you can identify the training and then make a bid to Mark and Martin for additional funding. I think there was £1,000 or more for some CPD, which could also maybe manifest itself as 3 or 4 schools, or it could be your cluster CPD. So if there's a gap between what you want to teach and the teacher knowledge in who's teaching it, then how are you going to meet that learning gap? How are you going to meet professional development needs? So that we are developing teacher need to meet learner need here. As with any good practice, the PAC that refers to psychomotor, affective, and cognitive domains. So that's the hands, heart, and head. Part of this is referenced from the book. I don't know if anyone has seen the book, but you'll notice that these are names of Everton players, or adapted names of Everton players, and the proofreader never picked it up. So it actually got published. So what we've got here is the refine, analyze, and participate. Along here, the success criteria, and you could see earlier that I've developed success criteria for the components of health, which are not necessarily going to cover, but that gives some headline criteria, and here it's just expanded some more. The implementation, the expansion on content is this middle bit really. So on the left-hand column, this is what we want them to learn. On the right-hand column, this is what it'd look like if children have learned it. And on the middle column, this is what we're going to do to close that gap, what we intend and the impact we expect. So this is like a micro cycle of intent, implementation, and impact. But importantly, we have aligned values and learning content. And we are connecting that learning content. So you can have a look at that some more. It'll get sent through. And it's just by way of introduction, but you do the intent in terms of your planning may need some reviewing and think, especially to get in reference to the physical activity and healthy active lifestyles. So you should be able to see my cursor waving over there. So it's not all about the performance in the sport. It now becomes, in its truest sense, physical education. And there's the criteria that we then use for assessment. Okay. So I've known schools that, yeah, okay, I'm not going to share that. That's the assessment. We're going to get into that a bit more on our next session. So Simon, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint show. Has that gone back?
Yeah, we see your presentation.
Okay. Okay, so on mastery learning, mastery isn't anything new. So though people who have attended the sessions at college and people who are then implementing that now as a physical education lead will understand that Bloom started this hierarchical verb categorization back in 1956, and lots of schools use that, but they only use the cognitive bit. But he did develop verbs for the psychomotor domain and also the affective domain, but for whatever reason schools are into this kind of cognitive science bit and just focus on that. But the whole cognitive science approach is that it's a multidisciplinary approach, and I don't think some schools have picked that up, so that it is about the domains in which children learn and grow. So let me go to a different slide, sorry. So this is taken from Bloom, and there are verbs around the head bit, there are verbs around affective bit, and then there are the domain, and there are verbs around the psychomotor domain. So I've given, if we are having a joined up mastery approach in terms of deep structural learning, then I've given the type of teaching and learning activities that are more aligned to that. And we're going to look at that in the second day. And then the implications for assessment practice. So the only thing I want to illustrate a little bit more now is this is give some examples of what synoptic outcomes might look like, because there are a couple of ways of doing this I just want to highlight now. One is, if we go back to the handout, I don't want to swap now, but the handout had 3 separate learning outcomes around head, heart, hands. But what you can do is create synoptic outcomes, so more comprehensive, more composite outcomes, if you like. So I'll just take this example then, participate positively and fairly. So it starts already indicating some of the values that you want to integrate, the roles and responsibilities, again values, individual and team competition. So you can either write 3 separate outcomes if we're going to have this holistic approach as well as integrative approach or synoptic approach, or we can write outcomes that combine, and we just we would separate that out in the lesson. So they're presented separately but then combined, and that then has implications for teaching and learning or implementation. So that could be like, your whole, part, whole, or part, progressive, part, whole. Lots of ways of approaching that. Lots of ways of presenting and constructing that through lessons. And I think the final thing that I want to where has it gone? That's an illustration of what mastery learning is. I've quoted Ofsted from their new framework on the right hand side, where they talk about understanding is where pupils connect new knowledge with existing knowledge, and this is why they're asking you how you sequence it, but also how you're making those connections in the lesson, within the lesson, without the lesson, and with other subjects. And the theory behind this, the fluency and unconsciously applies, that's those COL, but if people heard of COL, where you've got from conscious incompetence right the way through to unconscious competence, 4 stages of experiential learning. So yeah, Ofsted don't refer to theory, but in terms of the language they use, it is research informed. The expected standard for all pupils, unless they are special educational needs or disabled, is this: that children develop a number of ideas, i.e. tactics and strategy, and they can then link them together to other ideas around being physically active, around the importance of accuracy, control and accuracy in passing and so on. They can link these ideas to make a coherent whole. And that's important about how we teach this. I mentioned before about teaching games for understanding rather than warm-up, skill, game, and then the next lesson, warm-up, skill, game, next lesson, and warm-up, different skill, different condition, game. The game never moves on. It's not relational because it's all about applying that one skill and condition it in the game. So we need to look at other teaching and learning methods in our implementation. So when we're planning for it, it can be a synoptic outcome, lots of ideas, but when we deliver it, it is a whole different matter, especially if we're having to change our practice. But integrated into this needs to be values and whole physical activity and healthy active lifestyle. So in terms of language, the DFE, so lots of schools have adapted this type of thing. So unistructural, if we go back to the previous slide, we start at unistructural. Unistructural is basic, multistructural is developing, relational, the theory language, is expected or mastery as we understand mastery, and extended abstract is working at greater depth. So it's not working beyond, it's working at greater depth. It's more complex and it's more difficult. So that's an overview, and we are going to dig deeper into that with video. I'm going to challenge you with some tasks and questions when you're going to look at video on the second session and apply this knowledge in terms of judging where children are at. A short answer in terms of where schools are using converting progress and summative judgments to numbers or grades. Look, if you had to, you might number or grade these, but you don't need to because levels have gone. And this isn't about this isn't a level description. This is the stages of learning students go through, and you can get all students to a relational stage by the way you present information to them and the way you link and co-construct that information. Okay. So I've left about, well, let me take any questions, and then we've got about 25 minutes or so, or just less when we've done questions, to look at what we did term it a twilight session, what the session might be with, that's going to be kind of chaired by SLE, and that's their role. And I think it was Will, Colin and Ollie who attended the training. They were keen for you to also understand that it was that they are mentoring and chairing and rather than like coaching you in your practice, and that's their role. They're looking to facilitate discussion and coordinate and take thinking on. Simon, is there can you, because my screen's almost black. which is why you probably see me squinting like this. Are there any questions, Simon?
No questions that I can see at this time.
Okay. So I just want to try and summarise that again, really. When at the intent stage, we are combining our the school's vision, our own department vision, the values, because that is the cement that binds the building blocks of this learning work we're instructing. So values and the aims, and we can reference the aims of national curriculum. A school I work with, those from the Plymouth cluster may know Russ Martin from Plymouth School of Creative Arts. I'm doing some work with him now where he's referenced national curriculum and he's gone through all the documentation, but then changed language and changed the framework to suit his needs and his understanding at the moment. So they've ended up, because of the school and the school ethos, they've ended up with 5 aims for their PE national curriculum. And he's referenced the 4 aims that are already there, expanded them somewhat because he felt there wasn't enough in there, and it refers to much more around physical activity and healthy active lifestyles. And the 5th aim they put in was around specifically character and values. So even though it's listed in the purpose of the study in the programme of study for PE, even though character and values are mentioned there, it wasn't an aim, and Russ wanted it to be an aim. So he's really emphasised that aspect of it, and then that then comes through in his planning. So that's your job now. You might have something that you're really quite happy with, and your review shows that you're seeing impact, and you might want to just tweak it slightly, like almost like a radio channel where you've just got a bit of interference and you just slowly tweak the dial, and then you can bang, it's clearly receiving the signal. And other people might be in that point where they're going to spend this, I call this the great pause, in terms of you know, we haven't had an opportunity like this. You know, everything seems to be 100 miles an hour and full of innovation, and suddenly we've got this great pause, and we've got time at last to be able to sit back, reflect, and plan something that's really engaging, enthusing, appropriate, relevant, constructively aligned, research informed, evidence based for kids, for children that we just haven't had the time previously to do.
Andy, have you got any examples of a model, intent and programme of study?
The programme of study we've been using is the National Curriculum PE, the National Curriculum one. Are you able to clarify the question a little bit more, or?
Yeah, have you got examples of model, intent and programme of study? Alex, could you expand on that question, and I'll put it to Andy to answer.
So I could share on the screen some examples that we did with Qatar, but I'm not allowed to share them because it's their copy. Even though AFP and myself we wrote them, they belong to Qatar, so we're not able to share. But I could show it visually. So I could either do that. Examples that I talked about with Russ Martin from Plymouth School of Creative Arts. Again, I would want to ask permission before I shared that.
Yeah, should we share them at a later date once we've established permissions and go from there?
Yeah, because on the even though today is about the intent, when schools develop their intent, they should already have vision, values, aims, and broadly speaking, that they should be referencing national curriculum for that. So academies they use it as a reference document, but they're not statutorily required to follow it by the letter. But when you look at the national curriculum, as we have done, it is loosely coupled, and it provides a lot of flexibility for schools. And I've tried to illustrate what that flexibility might look like, in that one school might sequence content in year 7 that would look totally different to the content that's sequenced in another school, even if they were doing different, they've chosen to do different activities. And that will be informed by their knowledge of the children at that point in time, plus all the surveys and any audits they've conducted and so on. So they don't have to worry that they're doing anything different from other schools. They just need to have a thought through why they're developing particular content and sequencing that content in a particular way. Its inclusion in year 7, its inclusion in year 8, and its inclusion in year 9, and why are they scaffolding that way, and how it builds on previous learning. That's essentially all that Ofsted want. And so what you've got out there commercially is people that have worked with different subjects, and there's these like snake diagrams, pathway diagrams, which just literally is headline content in terms of a roadmap, headline content of its sequence through year 7, the road snaking into year 8 and then snaking into year 9, and along that roadmap, if you like, is the headline content.
Yeah, it'd be good to see what you the model you did for guitar. I think that's probably what they're mostly asking for. Another question: what are your thoughts on model-based approaches, physical education, as a vehicle to deliver the national curriculum?
So, okay, this is my opinion now. I've seen, and I've had like Twitter spats with people who are saying, right, I'm going to try this model this half term, this model next half term, or this model this term, this, and try out the different models. For me, it's about a no model. You teach what you see. So you develop your teaching based on the needs of learners, and assessment becomes the conduit for that, for informing the decisions that you make about how and what you teach and the order in which you teach. So even at the intent stage, you sequence learning, assessment, ongoing assessment may lead you to reorder what you've sequenced, and that's totally fine. I referred to models such as teaching games for understanding and sport education as examples of integrated, holistic approaches. But you may decide, because of what children are doing, that the reason children aren't able to access tactics and strategies and employ them effectively and successfully is because in terms of throwing and catching, they just can't do it. And at that point, you need to make a decision about how you're going to intervene. Are you going to intervene and do that and focus on a skills-based approach in lessons, where it depends on how many children, who, what, when, and whatever, or are you going to make that intervention and set up some skills activities at lunchtime, at break times, speak to the children's parents to say, look, they're not getting access to the curriculum because their agility, balance, coordination, and skill set is affecting all the rest of their learning. So there may be a time so that's why I call it a no model. But anything, if you want, I'm not saying don't use models, but if you want to have a look at a models-based approach, I remember sending a few people on Twitter a list of all the models that you can use in approaching teaching. And there's also books. Again, someone asked this morning about books. I'll send an example of books over if people want to do more background on that. But if, in terms of how our teaching should evolve to meet learners' needs, and if we are achieving the impact that we set out to, yes, we might look to raise standards in the future and constantly improve, but there's no reason at that juncture to move away from our method of teaching. The reason we want to move away, and I'm generalizing, the reason we want to move away from a warm-up, skill-based and apply that skill in the game, condition game, traditional approach, is because that approach has left this third of children disconnected, disengaged with physical education and physical activity. And that's the reason we need to move away from that and engage those children. So when we talk about teaching and implementation next time, and I'll give you insight, but from research, there's 7 things that we need, and I gave you insight into that in one of the slides earlier. We need these things as ingredients. Now, how we put those ingredients together is down to us, and what aspects we are looking to deepen and understand more and then apply is down to us. But the one thing that we do have to do, and again, I said I'll do more on the second day, is when we are differentiating to give learners access to learning. So lots of people spout out about, well, we need to differentiate by outcome, we need to differentiate by task. No, right, let's look at the learning content and what we expect from that. And just say at a basic level, we're looking at width and depth in attacking play, because we want to create and exploit space. So if we're looking at width and depth, that's the content we want to cover. Straight away, those people who understand width and depth because you play team games or you have played team games, that you want to see people going out wide to the touchline, whichever activity, whichever sport you're doing, and you want one person pushing on as much as the rules allow to the last person in football or in hockey, you can push right on, and then a playmaker really who sets the play. So your ball carrier in basketball, your centre in netball, your 10 in football. And in a lesson, you might have a group playing 4v2. Why? Because the activity is hockey, and they've not done much hockey outside of school, but then you'll have another group who's playing 5v5 or 6v6. Why? Because their parents are hockey players themselves. They've been really interested. They take their children to a local hockey club, and so that they've had more exposure to opportunity to play hockey. So they're still demonstrating width and depth in hockey, in attacking, because every time they regain possession, you see people going out wide, but they're going to have to individually, tactically, work much harder to lose their opponent. Have to drop a shoulder, move out, because there are more players, it's more complex and more difficult. But both sets of children are displaying they understand the concept of width and depth in their play. So these children have mastered it, and if they can apply that in another context in 4v2, they have mastered the concept of width and depth in attacking. But the 5v5, yes, they've mastered it, but they're mastering it in a far more complex and difficult situation. So they're working at greater depth. So we're not leveling that. We've given all learners inclusive access to learning about width and depth. And that's the one key difference, or the one way of looking that's different to previously when you look at inclusion, progress and mastery learning. So Simon, I'm going to try and just quickly pull up the Qatar stuff, because I do want to get this
up there. We got 2 more questions as well before we go to polls. But if you want to bring up the Qatar stuff, that'll be grand.
Right, what's showing on my screen now at the moment?
Current your presentation.
So I'm going to get rid of that. What's showing now?
Still the presentation. If you swap the show screen over to the other screen, we can see what you bring up there. But,
I see. Thank you.
and shared show screen, and go to I mentioned screen.
Clicked on something. What's come up now? Anything?
Yeah, perfect. We can see your Windows Explorer.
Tell them I got to sort out why this screen's so dark. You following all this, are you?
Yeah, we can see you're navigating to your Qatar folder.
Oh no, where was it? You have to bear with me while I'm.
Simon, Andy, while Andy's looking for that, is it worth putting the poll up again for the 9th of June, whether people want it via webinar or face-to-face? I think only about half the people answered.
Yeah,
I
bought the poll.
I'm not sure what it actually stated, but if we've come out of lockdown and if schools are back, it's a personal choice, I think, whether or not people want to.
Yeah, I think the majority so far were saying webinar. So if everyone could just vote on that, if you haven't already, please, that would be great. For the second session on the 9th of June. And then once you've done that, Simon will put another brief poll up. We build them as twilight sessions, but the cluster meetings in between the sessions delivered by Andy will have to be online as well. So Simon will just put up a question if you're happy for those to be delivered via Zoom. If you could just answer yes or no to that question when that comes up onto the screen, please. And whilst there's time, it might be worth, I will email this out to everyone afterwards, but Martin Smith is very keen to join those cluster meetings and work alongside Ollie, Colin and Will to facilitate those, if that's okay with you guys. Obviously you can't make your voices heard at the moment, but I'm guessing that you'd be fairly happy for Martin Smith to join you on these. That will give him a chance to explain a bit more about the sort of project action plans and give a bit more guidance around that. So dates for the cluster meetings, we set these sort of on a geographical basis. Obviously, if they're going to be via Zoom, then that doesn't matter so much, but maybe we stick to those clusters that I think Andy put up on your screens earlier. So Plymouth cluster, we're looking at Monday, the 18th of May, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. So an hour. Late morning for the cluster group, Monday, the 18th of May. For the Exeter cluster, Tuesday, the 19th of May, from 1:30 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. And then for the Oakhampton or North Devon cluster, Wednesday, the 20th of May, 11 a.m. until 12 p.m. So again, late morning for that. So hopefully you got those dates down. I'll email them out anyway. If you can't make one of the dates, so you're sort of in Plymouth, but you can't attend Monday the 18th, then obviously you can join in with one of the other two meetings. So up on the screen at the moment is just a quick question, yes or no, about meeting via Zoom. I know there's been some issues about people wanting to access Zoom because of the security, I think, but no doubt that's all been sorted now. But a lot of people are using Zoom at the moment, and hopefully you'll feel okay to have a discussion via that. So that's the cluster meeting dates and times. Next meeting looks like it's going to be via webinar on the 9th of June. Survey links. I did send out the links previously, and I think I've sent them to people again via email. Hopefully they've gone to everyone. If you haven't got the survey links, please let me know. You've got my email address, so just ping me a quick email and say you haven't got them, and I'll resend it all. But I think the majority of you will have those. Thanks very much to everyone who's completed those already. The SLA, we did mention, I think Martin Smith mentioned at the launch event that you met when you met at Exeter Court Hotel about there being an SLA, service level agreement, between your school and Dartmoor Teaching School Alliance. So I'll send that out as well after the session. Email it out to everyone. If you could just get that signed and sent back, that would be great. And that's all I've got. Back to you, Andy.
Am I on, Simon?
Yes, we can see your we can see your PDF and your webcam as well.
Okay. So this is part of a Qatar document, which, as you can see, is over 200 pages long, which was a guidance document to a 30-page document which outlined the statutory requirements of their national curriculum. And they've gone through as a country, we went through the same process that you will be going through now, especially incorporating healthy active lifestyle. So stage one was preparation and evidence gathering, and we had Professor David Kirk look at 5 countries and benchmark the Qatar current PE standards at the time against 5 international comparative countries. And we used Singapore, we used Scotland, we used the US, we used Australia, and one of the eludes me at the moment. And then I also, with a female consultant, we spent 2 weeks out in Qatar where we went into schools and observed lessons, interviewed head teachers, we interviewed PE teachers, we interviewed pupils, we spoke to other key stakeholders, and basically did a micro analysis of their system and how it manifested itself in practice. And as a result, made a number of recommendations, which we had to wait until they accepted before we then started writing the intent. Which we called development at the time. We looked at a second part of the development because one was the PE curriculum standards and one was a PE program, how they might develop that. Then the implementation of it, that's the teaching and learning, and then monitoring and evaluation being the impact. So Ofsted's, so we were following UNESCO stuff then, and all Ofsted are doing is saying we want to make sure that schools are following national guidance now that's research informed, and they've come up with their own language which is common to this country or endemic to this country, which is intent, implementation and impact. I'm going to have to whiz through then now really. We framed it in three broad questions saying, well, what is it we're trying to achieve? I kind of gave you that to say, well, what do we want our year 11s to look like after 5 years of PE with us? How are we going to organise the learning in our context? How are we going to organise the project? And then how well we are achieving. It's the same three questions that you'll be asking yourselves. I'm not going to get into some of the intricacies of it. We frame those questions to give a context to PE, the subject. So this is what they're trying to achieve. So that's the end point in terms of their vision, their values, their aims. How's the learning organised? It was organised through subjects, cross-cutting issues. We often call it cross-curricular. Oh no, what did I just do? And extracurricular, and how well are we achieving? So what we are trying to achieve is our intent. How's the learning organised? This is how it's going to be implemented. How we're achieving impact. We mapped physical education aims to the Qatar national curriculum aims, so we made sure that was aligned. These were our headline physical education outcomes, which for you are provided by as a reference, the national curriculum, and we looked specifically at tactics and strategies. Knowledge, skills and attitudes, that's your cognitive, there's your psychomotor. Attitudes is your affective domain. I think I can share it here. So we then further frame their curriculum into three strands that you can see on the right hand side. One is moving literally, we called it. The other was leading healthy, safe and active lives, and the third was building character. And we split each of those strands into three further strands. So moving literally was about movement skills, movement concepts and movement strategy. And we developed and scaffolded that and sequenced that over their school system. This was further divided into what we called valuing physical activity. How do we get children to value physical activity above their Xboxes? You know, could we get them to go home and do 15 minutes of HIIT before they get on Xboxes? Managing risk and selfie and physical activity for health and well-being. So those are the three areas we moved that into, and then building character. We looked at cultural and personal identity, communication and cooperation, and appreciating movement aesthetically. So that's how we further frame their curriculum, building on the curriculum they had before, because they didn't want to go totally transformational. So what they wanted was these are just mapping tables. So this was key competences that they wanted every subject to map to. And the importance of this, as it is in the new national the new inspection framework, is that we see the context of physical education and how it contributes to key competencies in their curriculum linked to other subjects. So where's its place, where does it fit? And I'm going to just, there's another, their cross-cutting issues or their cross-curricular issues that they'd identified in their overarching curriculum are on the left. And all we had to do was, in terms of the strands, the sub-strands that I just introduced you to, we just mapped those cross-curricular elements to that. So everything had to be aligned, and especially when you're doing it for a country, even more so. So you want to see a program, but that's just giving you some of the work that we did before we even got to that program. So that's just another visual of how it's all aligned. One of the things that UNESCO came out with in 2016 was saying, let's not mess about with objectives and outcomes, or objectives and outcomes and success criteria. Let's just write outcomes. We're just overcomplicating it for the end user, i.e. the teacher and even the pupils, to say that the lesson outcome should be a composite. It should reflect the unit outcome. It should be aligned to the stage outcomes, or the program outcomes that we call them in our national curriculum, or I was referring to today, and the overarching national curriculum outcomes. These were the ones in for Qatar. So when we write a P outcome, that's all we write. We don't write objectives and outcomes, and our objective looks a bit similar to outcomes, and then some people don't know the difference between objective and outcomes. Just say what we want to see each lesson and make sure that's aligned, which I quite liked. This is what I referred to earlier, that Bloom did do verbs for all of the domains, not just the cognitive domain that a lot of schools focus on. Loads in here. What you've got to understand, and there are some what we call red lines. When you work with any country, there's certain things that they want and they've always done and are fixed, and they say this is not going to be changed. But even so, we managed to change the language slightly. So if we look at preparatory stage, so it's roughly similar to our years. So they've got what they call early childhood, primary stage, preparatory stage, and then secondary stage. So roughly this is sort of key stage 3, just slightly higher. What they had previously, that every school does volleyball, every school does football, every school does handball, and every school does athletics. So there were 4 activities that every school did, and then they just started bringing in like gymnastic activities, but they didn't have the equipment for it. And so the way the state controlled everything, that in November, for example, if it was week 3, they knew that every school would be doing football, and in week 3 they'd be doing attacking strategy. So it started with week 1 was skills, week 2 they might do defending strategy, week 3 attacking strategy, week 4 they did a game. Then they would move on to a different activity. So there were certain red lines, but and they wanted learning specified, but we did manage to move away from it slightly. So we gave them future-proof this by just giving broad brush descriptors for the areas, and the schools hopefully in the future can then choose different different activities as the learning carrier. That's just a summary of what those broad areas look like and how they progress. The yellow bits are the physical activity and health, and so that it can be a discrete unit, but it can also be integral to all of their activities. And it was so important in Qatar because at the time they just overtaken the US as top of the league tables for obesity levels and deaths due to cardiovascular disease per percentage of population. So they now lead the league table, which is nothing to shout about in terms of the ill health of their country, if you like, and the obesity levels and all the illnesses that leads to, including diabetes and stuff. So it was imperative that physical activity and health and all that kind of stuff was integral to their program. We're not looking at implementation, that's the next day. You're going to look at a program. So this was guidance for them. This whole document's in guidance and illustrates the 30-page statutory curriculum that we provided them. So even down to stuff like this, whole school principles for the promotion of physical activity. Because the one thing you've got to realize, this is not, this project isn't just a PE thing. It is, we know from research that if you can get the senior leadership support and it becomes integral to whole school development, then you're going to have wide-reaching, far-reaching impact. So again, we were using that research and developing principles that they could use for promoting whole school. I'm not to know, of course, if you're taking pictures of this with your iPhones and stuff, but I'm certainly not contravening my requirement not to share any of their stuff. So let me just quickly show the program bit. More. And one of the things we're trying to get them to do is maybe take out some of the specifics to their country, but whether or not we can publish this. Someone said, is there any stuff out there that takes you through like the whole intent, implementation, impact stuff? Well, this document does. Here we go. Finally, so if I do, we'll look at the preparatory stage. So this took me all the summer of 2018 writing all this. Primary, come on, one more, and we're there. Here we go. So preparatory stage was their grades 7, 8, and 9. Apologies for all the scrolling and stuff. So what I developed with them was a curriculum map, unit sequencing and learning outcomes. So if you sequence include the units in the unit sequencing planning, then by definition the learning outcomes are sequenced. It's up to you what order the outcomes appear in the actual units and from week to week. But essentially by sequencing the units which contain the outcomes that you developed for the overarching curriculum, you've done that. And when you do it through the key stage for grade 7, 8, and 9, you're scaffolding. But what I also gave them was some indicative unit content, because they're so used to being spoon-fed. They wanted you to develop all the content for them, write it for them, and then that really we push back on that really. So the first thing we did for each of the and this was in chapter 2, I think it was, which is developing the P program and the outcomes. For each of the strands, there's moving literally. You can see movement skills, movement concepts, and movement strategy, which I introduced you earlier. And for each of those areas, we had outcomes, and we map where those outcomes may be best suited to in terms of the activity or the area of activity. So you didn't have to cover in them there, but we're saying that if we're looking at analysing and refining body awareness to perform in various activity contexts, we could best focus on other things in the physical activity and health area, and it may be more suited to that. So this mapping of outcomes against activity already gives you an idea of what we might include and when.
Andy?
Yes.
I'm just aware that we're 15 minutes over the finish time.
I know, people have asked this, so this is the last bit. I'm rounding it up really, but if people need to leave, they can. This is just I'm just responding to a question. So yeah, by all means.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Andy. There's a couple of other questions in there, but I wonder if we could send your answers to those out to everyone as a follow-up as well.
Okay. There's lots of reason why this was set out. It was, but we worked out they had 34 weeks in their year, but Ramadan is flexible in its dates. So what we've allowed there is 6 weeks in terms of Ramadan and other things that might interrupt the school year, which I know we have in this country as well. So it leaves it flexible that we can extend these units if with our assessment children need more time to master particular learning. And then games education 1 and 2, that could be the same game, or it could be a different game, but progressive and coherent, where we're looking to apply skills. We started, because of their summer holiday and their Ramadan, sometimes it combines, so there's a massive gap, almost like what we've had off school at the moment. So we started the year with physical activity, learning about physical activity, which previously was just fitness testing they used to do. There was no physical education about it. It was just fitness testing. So part of this is down to their red lines. I wouldn't, but there's still a rationale for why it's sequenced like this and so on. So this is a curriculum map in terms of the activity. It's certainly not a curriculum map in terms of learning, but it becomes a curriculum map in learning when you then, for grade 7, learning about physical activity and health 1 and 2. So that's this bit here and this bit here. So it allows them to work through, it allows them to integrate, and it allows them to pick up just when they're going to go away. So it's giving children the tools required to stay physically active in a long period of shutdown, including what they might do in Ramadan when they're not eating or taking on board fluids during daylight hours. So in here let's just go this. We put the learning outcomes that we plan. So this would be the program linked to the program learning outcomes national curriculum. This is the indicative content. This is a description of the teaching and learning activities, and then other things that you won't be concerned with because this was specific to their country. But one thing you might be the cross-cutting issues and links with other subjects, i.e. the place of PE. And that was it really. That's what it looked like, but there was a rationale for why it was arranged as it was. I think we start putting some information. Yeah, so the outcomes are sequenced by stage. That's what we looked at earlier. And then in the following unit examples, the outcomes are also sequenced by grade. So in year 7, year 8, and then year 9. So this table on its own isn't really sufficient in the current climate. It's a list of activities, but when it's then the outcomes are actually developed for each of those activities from our overarching outcomes here, we then sequence in the outcomes. And we're saying what outcomes we're covering in grade 7, and then we look at the corresponding unit. What outcomes we're focusing on then in grade 8, and how that builds on not only the same unit the previous year, but the previous unit, how it builds on the previous unit that was at the end of the previous year. And that's important. It's not rocket science. It can be time consuming, but a lot of you will have this documentation in place. Their schools didn't. They've got a lot of work over there to do, but they're writing it as they're going. If you're in that position, yeah, do that. Write it as you're going. You just need to be a few units ahead. You can have an overarching idea, but then put the meat on the bones as you go through the year. But many of you will have this type of stuff in place, and it's easy then to tweak what you've already got. The overriding concern, though, is to ensure that physical activity and healthy, active lifestyle outcomes become integral to everything you do. Questions, Simon? What was the? Are they quick questions?
Not really. What we'll do is we'll get you to answer these questions, and then we'll follow them up with an email. I think because we'll be here for quite some time. Okay. But we'll leave it there for now.
It might. Well, we can follow up with two things. One, we can follow up with an email, but if it leads into next session, we'll pick them up next session. Or it might be that I discuss or talk, email the SLEs, and that they can feedback the answers to the questions into their discussion in the twilights, in their intermediary session.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, perfect. All right then, should we wrap it up there?
Yeah, I desperately need a drink of water. I didn't come into this session with my water bottle, so I've been struggling. But thank you very much. I mean, it must be difficult when it can't be as interactive. But thank you for people's forbearance. Oh, yeah, the one thing that they do need to pick up in the sessions, in the final slide, which we haven't gone through, Mark, was about the actions. Now, just a summary. As I've gone through, I've highlighted certain actions to be taken, but some schools may be ahead of the curve, ahead of the wave, if you like, already, so that some schools may have more actions than others. It all depends on starting point.
I think, to be clear to everyone, it might be better to send out a follow-up email, Andy, to everyone with those actions, and also to follow up on meeting dates and how they're going to be delivered and that sort of thing.
Okay. All right, Feda. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to Mark. Thanks especially then to Simon in the background, who's kept this webinar running. And although we had a few problems starting at the first one, it's been pretty smooth. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Andy, as well. And I think before everyone goes, Simon had a quick evaluation, if people could put their answers on that if it works before you leave. Thank you.
Thanks very much.